So welcome to our next video, and today we're going to look at theories for evolution. Now before we do so, let's just have a look and a recap at what we looked at so far. Now you'll notice our title's called Theories of Evolution. Evolution is a theory. It's not proof. It doesn't mean that it can't change, but it is a theory that we have that has lots of different evidence to support it. And our most important pieces are our fossil record, our evidence from our living species, so that would come under DNA, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, and also our geographical distribution. Now, initially, when all of these ideas about evolution were presented, they were extremely controversial, and that's because they conflicted with a lot of the ideas that the religious community held tightly. And in the earlier days, our religious clerics were well respected, and what they said was often true, and not many people really wanted to contradict what the church had said. So most people, even including scientists initially, believed that everything that we had was created by God, it was unchanging, and that the earth was only a few thousand years old. But once a few of these scientists started collecting pieces of evidence, they actually realized that this was not actually the case. Now, while Charles Darwin often gets all the credit for the theory of evolution, he did have another person developing the same theories at the same time, Alfred Wallace. However, the idea that living things changed over a period of time is often credited to Darwin. It was actually proposed before he was even born. He was just one that went along and collected the evidence to support that theory. But he wasn't the only person to put forward a viewpoint with regards to evolution. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in 1829 also put forward his opinions on how he thought the evidence that we have, so our fossils over time, had changed. And his suggestion was that animals could actually acquire characteristics during their lifetime and pass them on to their offspring. So if giraffes got their long neck because they always stretched it to reach their food, that they too would be able to pass that long neck on to their offspring. Now, some people did agree with this, these thoughts. However, it was later refuted, and that evidence no longer stood, and we no longer believe in that. Often we do talk about Lamarck when we talk about evolution, but it's not a theory that we're going to focus a lot on because it was aborted in terms of a theory that we would support. So our theory that is still standing at the moment and was put forward by Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin was the evolution by natural selection. So we really need to think about some questions when we look at this. Where did the humans come from? How closely related are we to other living things? Why do some things look similar when other things don't? And why are there clues that life may not have always been the same? So let's have a look at Charles Darwin. He did not come up with the idea. He was the person to give sound reasons that things may have evolved. He also wasn't the only one. Alfred Wallace also put forward the same sort of ideas. Now, the reason that it's got credit is that he put forward vast amounts of evidence. Using that evidence, put forward a credible theory. It has been modified over time, but it's essentially based on the same foundations. So, what is causing organisms to change? These two gentlemen here on the right-hand side are Charles Darwin here and Alfred Wallace here. So what is their theory? Now, this theory has a number of different parts, and all of these parts are important. And in any answer you have, it is important that we include each and every one of these parts. So, what is evolution? Evolution is when populations of organisms, not individuals, you notice, populations of organisms are changing over a period of time. Now, according to the gentleman, all of our animals that we have or most of our animals that we have, will actually produce more offspring than is necessary. So if you think of rabbits and dogs and cats, they will often produce upwards of 6, sometimes 10 in a litter. Now, many of those offspring are not going to survive. That's because there's competition for food, shelter, there'll be predators. The only ones that will survive are the fittest and the strongest. Now, we're not talking fittest in who can run the fastest, although that may be certainly a help. We're not necessarily talking the strongest in terms of muscle size, but those that are best suited to their environment, and that is called the survival of the fittest. So all of the individuals in a population will have variation. You'll notice that you are not exactly the same as your brothers and sisters. Cats in a litter are not all the same. There will be different characteristics that different organisms in that species might have. Now, those that are more favourable to the environment they are living in at the moment are better adapted to survive in that environment. They haven't adapted to their environment. They are better suited to their environment because they have favourable characteristics. Now, if they are better suited to their environment, due to the favourable characteristics that they have, they earn the reward of being able to reproduce. Those that are strongest and fittest will live long enough to reproduce, and they will pass on their favourable characteristics that enabled them to survive in that environment. So where is this variation coming from? This variation is coming from the genes that they possess. And later in this year, you're going to look at genetics and how those genes are passed on in a little bit more detail. But this theory hinges on two important features. The variations might be caused due to the genes, but the variations may also be due to the environment. Now, our genes are short pieces of DNA that contain our building code. They're the ones that determine what features that we will have. Now, individuals of the same species may share many of the same genes, but due to some mutations, some of them might be a little bit different. They might have random changes, and it's those random changes that may actually make them more suited to their environment. So if we have a look here, these are the finches that we were talking about when Darwin moved around and noticed that the finches had different characteristics and looked very different to the finches on different islands. So here are these finches, and they all seem a little bit different. While they may have they may have some similarities, they also have some differences. And one of the differences here is their beak. So if you look in picture 1, his beak is quite wide, it's quite large. 2 is a little bit smaller. 3 is quite pointy, but still a bit broader across the top. And 4 is pointy and quite narrow. Now that will make them able to eat different types of food. So some might have had narrow, sharp beaks to get insects out of the ground. Others have got large, broad beaks for crushing foods and seeds. Now, if we're in an environment that actually has large seeds that need cracking, and we've got bird number 4 there, he or she may struggle to open up those fruits and seeds and therefore not have the food. They may then not survive and then will not pass on their characteristics. So in that environment where we might have fruits and seeds that need crushing, we may actually see more then of the finch number 1, and then they would reproduce and produce more of finches very similar to number 1, and over a period of time the species might change. But there are some environmental factors that sometimes can affect what characteristics an organism there might have. So these are called selection pressures. There might be a change in the chemical environment. So if the environment there changes, either the presence or lack of oxygen, those organisms that are suited to that will survive and pass on their characteristics. There may be changes in the physical environment. For example, the water temperature. There might be then competition for the food that is around. and it's those factors then will select what individuals will survive. So one of the famous examples that we look at is the tasty peppered moth. And in this case here, and there is an activity that you can go on and have a look at called the peppered moth simulation. And we are noticing here in England, prior to the Industrial Revolution, that we actually had a whole host of moths that were white. And the trees also had white bark. But along came the Industrial Revolution, and what actually happened is they were producing a lot of soot from their industry, and they were lining the trees. Now, there was always black moths and there was always the peppered moths. But on the white trees, the white peppered moth was camouflaged, so he wasn't that obvious, so the birds could see the black moths and would swoop down and eat those moths. But with the change in the environment, what's happening now is our trees are covered in a dark soot. So now my dark moths are well suited to the environment. They're camouflaged, and my white moths are now being predated upon because they're visible. Now there's still always that mutation. We're always going to get the black and the peppered moths coming up, but it's those that at that time that are more suited to their environment that will live to survive and pass on those characteristics. Plenty of other examples that we can use there, but this is a famous one that's always a good example to use. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those changing populations in our next video. See you then.